I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamane, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or City of Demons, depending on who you ask. And we are internationally syndicated, as well as we are streaming on YouTube. For those of you in the YouTube chat, I want to thank you for being loyal. I want to remind you all that the U.S. network is late night in the Midlands, as well as the terrestrial affiliates associated with them. And in the U.K., we have Deprogram Radio with their terrestrial affiliates, as well as listeners in the EU. So this is, in fact, like I said, an international global show. And as I promised you, another powerhouse guest this hour is someone that you all should know. He is the executive producer and co-writer of the Showtime's film Roswell. I promise most of you that you've seen that and probably didn't even know who I'm about to introduce. He also was the production coordinator of all 79 Transformers cartoons, wrote 6 Star Wars novels, and also produced, directed, and wrote 10 other films aside from Roswell. As a matter of fact, I have one here that I've seen, a fantastic one, The Life After Death Project, which is something we talked about a couple years ago. Actually, it was closer to 3 years ago, the last time he was on. And the next time when I can get him for 2 full hours, we're going to go much deeper into that. So without further ado, I've given a lot of background already, but we're going to get so much more from the one and only Mr. Paul Jeffrey Davids. Paul, welcome back.
Hi, Dr. J. Thanks for having me back.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you. This is a phenomenal resume. When I was working with Third Phase and Moon, and because they're big on Star Wars as well, and they actually won a Guggenheim Award for producing every year. Lucas Arts or Lucasfilms does something where if people recreate scenes of Star Wars. And so when I told them that you wrote these books, they actually said, you know, they had some. And I remember them showing me on Skype video, you know, some of your books. And that, of course, I saw your name. So it was just fantastic. Now, let's talk about some of these other projects that you've worked on and what you're currently working on leading up to what we're going to talk about, which might as well say right now, a book everybody out there should get, Blowing America's Mind, a true story of Princeton, CIA, mind control, LSD, and Zen. But before we get to that, let's go back to when you started getting involved in production.
Well, the beginning of production. Roswell was a live-action Showtime movie with actors, a drama. So that was the first major television production that wasn't animated. Of course, all of the Transformer original cartoons, that was animation over at Marvel. And then from there, I had the contract with Lucasfilm on the 6 Star Wars books. That maybe some of your listeners grew up reading those books. They were young reader books, but they were also published as adult books. So it started with The Glove of Darth Vader and The Lost City of the Jedi, all the way up through Prophets of the Dark Side was a series. So then came Roswell for Showtime, which it took me like 4 years to get it off the ground. 4 years of a lot of very sad and painful rejections, Dr. J, until Showtime said yes, and then we made that film with Kyle MacLachlan of Twin Peaks in a starring role, and we had Dwight Yoakam, the country singer. We had Martin Sheen, and it's like a cult classic now. I think it's been on TV, I don't know, just dozens of times. And a little hard to find now. They don't make the DVD available anymore. They had a 10-year contract for putting out the DVD of Roswell, the movie, also called Roswell, the UFO Cover-Up. So that's a little rare to find now. And then from then, I jumped into making all of these other independent films, one after the next. Most of them released for television by NBC Universal. And that kept me afloat. It kept me alive in the business the fact that these films were getting out there. So I'll give you some of the titles. Your listeners, I'm sure, have seen some of them. Well, the first one was Timothy Leary's Dead, which was the biography of the psychedelic LSD promoter from Harvard, Timothy Leary, which I made with him the last year of his life. And I made Starry Night, a fantasy drama I had written about Vincent van Gogh. And there's a new Van Gogh movie coming out, by the way, called At Eternity's Gate, which I just saw last night with Willem Dafoe, who should be nominated for Best Actor for that one. He looks like Van Gogh. He is Van Gogh. It's just a fantastic performance. And, of course, then there was Loving Vincent, which was done in animation. There's been a lot of movies about Van Gogh, and I made Starry Night, which was one of them. And then I jumped on to the Sci-Fi Boys, the history of special effects in movies with Peter Jackson as the host. And Jesus in India, I would guess probably a lot of your listeners saw that movie.
Yes.
It was a really challenging production. We were in India filming 6 weeks across 4,000 miles of the country. And then there was Before We Say Goodbye, about the miracle of the Our Lady of Guadalupe. And then there was The Artist and the Shaman. And you mentioned the Life After Death Project, which was 2 movies. Now that you can get that as a DVD set, the 2 of them. Life After Death Project was on Sci-Fi Channel, and then I made a sequel called Life After Death Project 2, Personal Encounters, which is streaming now on Amazon. Others of my movies are streaming on Amazon too, like Before We Say Goodbye, I mentioned that, and Marilyn Monroe Declassified, which is my most recent release. That's streaming on Amazon. I must be leaving something out along the way. But I've written books also, and one of them we talked about a couple of years ago. First was the movie Life After Death Project, and then the companion book was called An Atheist in Heaven.
Yes.
The Ultimate Evidence for Life After Death. So that was a very personal project and consumed me greatly. And it's been shown a lot of times, a lot of different venues, Sci-Fi Channel, a lot of conferences. But that brings us up to this year, where my book was published that I co-authored, called Blowing America's Mind, as you mentioned. A true story of Princeton, CIA mind control, LSD, and Zen. Came out at the beginning of this year, and a lot of people are getting very, very involved in that story.
A lot of people contend that Mkultra, the CIA's program for mind control, one of the first experiments they used on people was LSD. Is that what this book talks about? Yes,
as a matter of fact, I was a student at Princeton. I was an undergraduate there, a psychology major. And my co-author on this book, John Selby, was a psychology major at Princeton, too. He was a little older than I was. And both of us signed up for research at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute, which was a few miles from Princeton. Doesn't exist anymore, but at that time it was a hotbed of LSD and deep hypnosis research. And the key researcher there, very famous, Dr. Humphrey Osmond. I'll tell you a little about him, why he was so important. He was a friend of author Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. And Huxley also wrote The Doors of Perception, about his first experience with mescaline. And Humphrey Osmond turned him on with mescaline. He was the guide. So Osmond, who came from research in Canada, in Saskatchewan, with psychedelic drugs, he was one of the first pioneers of LSD research, along with Timothy Leary. But Leary was at Harvard. Osmond was located at Princeton with a cohort named Bernard Aronson, who was the expert in hypnosis. And both John Selby and I were absolutely fascinated by this research. We volunteered, we signed up for it, so we were knowingly getting into something that involved mind research and did involve our being given LSD and also trained in undergoing deep hypnosis. What we didn't know at the time was that it was all funded by the CIA. It was part of the CIA's MKUltra program. And this was hidden from us, and the real goals of the program were hidden from us. So there was deception involved in terms of what the subjects were told. So we wrote a book based on our experiences there. So this goes back in time to the early days of what we call the Psychedelic Revolution. It's the late 1960s, but it's all true. It's the story of how we walked into this cuckoo's nest of a neuropsychiatric institute and barely came out whole, John, Dr. J. barely came out, intact at that time. And the book, Blowing America's Mind, tells our true story, and it's a whale of a story. It's an incredible story.
That time, LSD was still legal, and I'm assuming that's why you were able to go to the New Jersey Psychiatric Institute and have such experiences. What year did LSD become illegal and become stigmatized as something that would be wrong or would make you cuckoo, as opposed to when people were saying, take a trip? Or I've seen the old posters from the 60s that were encouraging people, hey, take a safe trip, you take LSD, things like that. So I'm assuming that in that era, if you were getting LSD from this institute and also from, I believe you said Dr. Osmond, from mescaline as well, clearly these psychiatric experiences, they were being researched so you could figure out, people could figure out what they do inside their head. And I'm sure you know this too, Paul, right now, that there are people that are operating under the radar, away from the law, because they're using things like mushrooms, things like mescaline, things like ayahuasca, things like LSD, to help people resolve some issues they have, whether it be if they're coming to pass away, or if they have to tell a loved one something, like they haven't had that bonding experience about, hey, I'm going to be dying soon because of my stage 4 cancer. Was this sort of the research that was being done when you were there?
That's a multi-part question, Dr. J, and I'll sort of take it one part at a time. LSD became illegal in 1966. So actually, the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute had a dispensation to do this research, but up until 66, anyone could own LSD, and it was widely distributed. Ken Kesey, the electric Kool-Aid acid test is about Ken Kesey and his bus trip, and this is the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The electric Kool-Aid acid test was Ken Kesey taking this bus around the country and giving acid to people by the thousands in different cities, their first trip. And then that all came to an end. The government got involved. They outlawed it, except for certain research. So the research that we walked into, you mentioned things, that now they're discovering certain benefits of these drugs. I think they knew about then. They knew about those benefits, but they were demonized. And there were all these scare stories put out. And of course, there were bad trips happening to a lot of people that either shouldn't have been taking it or were taking it under bad circumstances, bad setting. We were working with psychiatrists who were some of the best informed in the world about what could be done with LSD. And these were people who had also, as I said, worked with mescaline, which is the peyote cactus. active ingredient, and psilocybin, which is the magic mushroom. The thing there were two things I want to get at. One, what the purpose of the research is, and the fact that the book, Blowing America's Mind, we recaptured that era in a way where you can't find it anywhere else now, except perhaps in a book like The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe. John Selby and I began writing this book 50 years ago when we were students, when we were undergoing this. We captured the freshness of it. We used all the real names in this, but we didn't publish until everyone was deceased. And we intended to publish much sooner, but a lot of things got in the way. And our careers moved on in different directions, and I was doing movies, and John Selby was writing many other books. And then we came back to it now that we're senior citizens. And basically this worked its way to the top of our bucket list. And we said, hey, are we going to put this book out while we're above ground? Or is it just going to stay dusty in a drawer as an unpublished manuscript forever? And we were both very motivated. We had always really believed in this book. The characters are so alive and really interesting. And it is a college story. We were students at Princeton. So, there's a lot of stuff there about the relationships with girls and the parties and the sex lives and marijuana, which at that time was very stigmatized. I mean, in New Jersey, where Princeton is at that time, you could go to jail for 10 years for possession of marijuana. And there were students arrested, friends of ours arrested when we were there, who they were kicked out of school within a day after they were arrested and never returned. I don't know how they resolved their legal problems, but it was really, really dark and serious how it was treated. So when you think about how far things have come, how things have changed related to marijuana in all those years, and as far as the other drugs are concerned now, you have people in Silicon Valley microdosing with LSD for the psychological awakening and some benefits that can come from that. And you have psilocybin being looked at as an effective drug to use in post-traumatic stress disorder. We've lived in dark times where these drugs that have positive aspects to them were so demonized, outlawed, people sent to jail by the thousands, people still in jail for simple possession of marijuana. And I want to say that as the former Republican head, Speaker of the House, Mr. Boehner, wrote recently, I think in an editorial or an op-ed, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, pleading that marijuana has to be reclassified now. It's still listed as the same level as heroin.
Schedule 1, yeah.
It's insane. It is insane that hasn't been changed yet. This must be done. But it hasn't been done yet. I mean, we got most of the states of the union now have legal marijuana, either just for medical or recreational. Mexico is about to go completely legal. Canada has already gone completely legal. The fact it's still listed as Schedule 1 and they can still prosecute you, it's beyond belief, Dr. J. But the benefit of our book for your readers, Blowing America's Mind, is it'll really put you there in those times when all of this came about, when all of it started. And you'll really see an inside story from that era by people that lived it and had never told it before.
The CIA was deeply involved definitely with one Harvard professor who, at least Dr. Theodore Kaczynski says, or his family says, was deeply affected by him, because this professor, I don't know his name, was one of the people who the CIA contracted to work with him or with psychology students who were sort of weakened in some way or sort of outcast, to sort of perfect the precursor to the MK Ultra program. I would think because of the proximity and because of all the Ivy League schools in that region, Princeton, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, all those other schools will also hotbed activity for the CIA for both recruitment and for testing. Did you ever see?
By the way, that's absolutely true. And the materials that came out about MKUltra when it was declassified and exposed listed the different universities that had projects funded by the CIA, and not just the universities, but hospitals connected with them, and prisons and research centers. There were 86 institutions in the United States that were funded by the CIA surreptitiously, meaning it was all secret, as part of MKUltra mind control research in those days. And the tentacles of this thing were vast. We took the title of our book, which we call Blowing America's Mind. Of course, you can find it at Amazon. You find everything there now. But Blowing America's Mind, our title came from an editorial that was in the Los Angeles Times at that time when MKUltra was first exposed, and the title of their editorial was The CIA, Blowing America's Mind, making the point that here is part of our government that was set up supposedly to defend our freedoms, which was putting individual liberties and freedom at risk through this absolutely bizarre, massive mind control experimentation program.
The prisons, I've never actually considered it, but then again, that would make perfect sense, especially people that were sentenced to life. They were not going to come out. Who are they going to complain to, by the way?
Yeah.
That would be, and it just boggles my mind that I've never actually considered that. And when you just said 86 institutions that the CIA secretly funded for their programs, that's a vast, vast number.
They set up these bogus corporations with these strange names to funnel the money through, so no one could trace it back to the CIA. Our project was funded under Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Okay, what does that mean? What does it have to do with anything? I don't know. But going back to the prisoners that were used, I forgot to mention military men, too, of course, because they also experimented on enlistees, draftees. But the prisons, Dr. Timothy Leary at Harvard, one of his experiments, which has been written up a great deal about it, was giving magic mushrooms, psilocybin, to prisoners, and they were looking for, I think they call it, I can't pronounce it, the recidivism, the rate at which these prisoners end up going back to prison for another crime at a later time. And they found that the population of prisoners who had the psychedelic experience, that far fewer of them ever ended up in prison again than the general prison population. People reported having these cosmic mind expansion experiences. And so you could conclude it helped them. These things that help people, they're against the law. They put you in jail for it. It's just, I've already said it. It's the law itself is schizophrenic on this, and it just needs work. It needs to be sorted out.
It's actually very mind-boggling, especially if their own data shows that these prisoners are not violating crimes again or violating the law again and re-offending and going back to prisons. I would think just those statistics in itself would say, okay, if we're not going to legalize it for recreational use, let's legalize it for medical use, or psychiatrists can dispense it to their patients, and we can sort of reform them. But what they
did, Dr. J, by outlawing all of the psychedelics, they at that point, they closed down all the research. We still had LSD experiences at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute when we were there. They still had quite a supply from Sandoz. I think they were supposed to turn it all in at some point, but they hadn't. They were still working with it. But the laws shut down all that research, so we had how many years? 40 years, 50 years of a complete blackout of progress on knowledge on these substances. And it's just tragic. But I think finally we've come through the fog on that. People have begun to wake up and discover. I mean, when you have the former Republican Speaker of the House now saying that marijuana must be legalized, this is the same political party that absolutely refused to consider that for decades. You know, and you had a few liberals pushing for it, though it was risky. We've seen enormous social change. I mean, we're at the beginning, hopefully, of a new era and breakthroughs on this. And again, I go back to our book, Blowing America's Mind, and the subtitle, A True Story of Princeton, CIA Mind Control, LSD, and Zen. We involve Zen in this too. The point is, here you see the origins of it, the true story told by the people who lived it. Right, you're right inside our skin with this, all of the emotions, and we had some problems from this. As I said, it was MKUltra funded. They were looking to determine the differences between the reactions to psychedelic drugs and also using hypnosis induction of changes in reality that would induce symptoms like the psychedelic mind expansion and also induce symptoms of schizophrenia and paranoia. And they were looking for what the differences are in your perception of the world in terms of whether you go into this freaked out, paranoid, psychotic-like state versus having an experience which seems expansive and illuminating and totally positive. And they found that as they change people's perceptions of time, for example, slowing time down, speeding it up, stopping time under hypnosis, or ending your depth perception so you'd see everything flat, or expanding your depth perception, or giving you under hypnosis this sense of being shrunken down and very small and seeing everything around you as very large, or freeing you from your body and having an out-of-body experience. That we have that in the book. It happened to John Selby when they hypnotically turned him into a bird and told him to fly away. And he was... Well, they would wipe out memories of these experiences. They would block them out and then gradually restore them to you later in the program. But he had the sensation that part of him had flown away. He remembered that experience, flown away and never come back. And he was looking for the missing part of himself. And they elevated him to be a hypnotist there, but he was a hypnotist having a nervous breakdown while he was doing the research. So these are the things I think that made the story really, really fascinating and worth telling.
The deep hypnosis that was being employed at the New Jersey Psychiatric Institute, compared to what hypnotherapists are doing now, have you seen anything differently employed then, or was it the combination of them with the LSD that made it so effective?
Well, I don't think anyone that I'm aware of from the literature I've read is using hypnosis now to do the kinds of things that Humphrey Osmond and Bernard Aronson were doing back then. Most of what I read about the use of hypnosis in therapy today has to do with recovering lost memories. So you have a lot of use of hypnosis in the UFO abduction cases, the reports that people are convinced that they were abducted by aliens, but a fog went over their memory, and hypnosis is used to help recover the details of it, sometimes very effectively, such as in the Betty and Barney Hill case, and many, many other cases. Before I get off that subject, I want to say that I was just at a conference where I picked up this book. It sells list prices like $200. It's a very rare book. It's almost 700 large pages of the abduction conference that was held at MIT when Dr. John Mack was still alive. And you get to see that the research into abduction was massive, and that hypnosis was then and still is one of the major tools for that. They also, some of the therapists use hypnosis attempting past life regression on the theory that reincarnation is true and that hypnosis could be used to help you recover memories of past lives. I don't know that it's been proven that reincarnation is true. Well, but there have been some cases with some very compelling evidence. But that's how I see hypnosis used today. With us, they wanted to change our perceptions of reality and say, wait a minute, if we take away this person's depth perception so they see everything flat, we see that during the 2 hours that they're under the hypnotic condition, and you're not just lying there in a chair with your eyes closed, they wake you up under a hypnotic condition. They might see from loss of depth perception that you become very introverted, very quiet, that you just want to cower in a corner or get in a fetal position on a chair or a couch. You're not outgoing at all. You've lost all sense of space. It's like being claustrophobic, like being trapped in an elevator for 2 hours. Horrifying experience. Versus expanding your depth perception so that everything that you're seeing is it's illuminated in a new way with a sense of vastness, of distance in everything that you're seeing, and seeing things in much greater detail. You get a completely different personality reaction. You get someone who's ebullient, who becomes happy and outgoing and euphoric. So that was the intent of the research. The CIA was really interested in that. What do psychedelic drugs do? What is it the same as madness? Is it the same as schizophrenia and psychosis? Or are they two different things? So that's the niche of the research that we were part of, that we were caught up in, that is told in Blowing America's Mind.
LSD was also used as a primitive truth serum in the early days, especially for people who had never smoked marijuana or had maybe even not had drank or anything that had elevated their mind to a status other than what they're used to. So I could imagine some KGB prisoner being caught here in the United States as a spy living in the U.S. And, of course, the FBI is interrogating him, or the CIA outside the U.S. is interrogating him. Again, for all the people listening, the CIA cannot operate within domestic borders cannot operate within or so without a domestic agency attached. And so therefore, if they're going to hold an operation, say kicking down doors to hunt for a suspect, usually it's in combination with the FBI, ATF, etc. But doing experiments like this, or secretly, clearly they're operating and doing everything they want. And Paul, I'm sure
it was illegal. It was illegal under their own charter. There was a Senate hearing about this. The Church Committee. It was acknowledged that it was illegal. Sidney Gottlieb had to testify. He was one of the CIA people who was placed in charge of all of this. I think he was one of the Project Paperclip people, when they brought the German scientists over who had been Nazis during the war, and they gave them a clean bill of health, and they brought them into the American military system or scientific research system. So you had those people in the CIA, like Gottlieb. It was declared illegal in the Church Committee. by that time, there was a new CIA director. By the time it was discovered, sort of years after it had closed down, you had Stansfield Turner in charge of the CIA instead of Richard Helms. Turner, I think he was a Navy admiral, was appointed by President Jimmy Carter. So he didn't have to take responsibility for what had happened. He said, this is part of the history, the past, a dark past of the CIA. Before I took over, this is never going to happen again. But, who knows what's been happening? They won't tell us anything, So there you go.
The CIA. Well, first of all, let me say this. This is a great little saying that I'm sure you've probably seen by now. The war on drugs is over. Drugs win. I get a kick out of it every time I see it. But one of the big things which I'm sure you know about is the CIA's activity in drug running. So their list of illegal activities is so long and dirty. I wonder if the only reason marijuana is still classified as a Schedule 1, which I'm sure you might even agree, is because about money. If they can't control how to distribute it, if anybody can grow it, if it's very easy to grow, well, then how can they have a stranglehold? And this is another crazy piece of trivia. Like you said, Schedule 1, it's up there with heroin. But cocaine is not Schedule 1. It's technically Schedule 2 because the dentists up until the early 80s were using that before Novocaine and then lidocaine. But again, to classify...
And that's addictive, right? That's addictive. Marijuana is not addictive.
Or I don't understand how they classify it even as a psychedelic, for that matter. Because, see, we live in California now. It is recreational here. I don't see people coming in and out of the stores looking like they're talking to trees or cars. I never seen that thing. So for them to classify it as a psychedelic, I don't know where they sort of got these ideas, but where was the research for all this for them to classify such thing? But again, it goes back to what I was talking about, the CIA. I think the reason why it's still Schedule 1 is because they're involved in drug running, and because the government can't make money on it. Maybe the CIA and the other agencies that we don't know, all the alphabet soup agencies that are running covertly, want to keep things illegal. That way they can continue to make a profit to fund
that battle seems to have been lost, clearly, in terms of speaking about cannabis. I want to go back to something you were talking about, Dr. J, when you're talking about using LSD as a truth serum.
Yes.
How it might be used on a captured KGB spy. That's sort of the one-on-one basis of using it for an espionage purpose. They had another goal in mind, where they wanted to see if it could be effective in getting an army, an enemy army, to lay down their arms and stop fighting on the battlefield. The big problem in making that work was, how are you going to disseminate it? I mean, we've all heard about those who had talked about, well, what if it was put in a drinking supply? Well, no, maybe that doesn't work. Maybe there's a chemical reaction. I don't know. But I don't think any of those tests were successful for them, and I think that their interests sort of turned on to other things. But at that time, the dissemination of LSD throughout the United States was quite massive before it was made illegal. Many, many, many people were, as they say, turning on with it. And then you had Timothy Leary from Harvard. Actually, he was fired from Harvard over some of his experiments with undergraduates, but you had him proselytizing it, and a whole generation following him, like he was the Pied Piper. And, of course, I decided years later, it was I think 1995, we began doing a movie that was a biography of Timothy Leary with him. So I had the opportunity to work very closely with him. And I think one of the reasons he was willing to work with me and let me make the movie was that I had been connected with Dr. Humphrey Osmond at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute, and he and Osmond had been close at one point. So that gave me credibility with him. And it was absolutely fascinating to explore his life. I mean, here's a man who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for possession of 1 joint of marijuana, okay? He served 5 years in prison. His story was incredible. He escaped. He went to Switzerland, where he was granted asylum. He got bored in Switzerland. He said that's the reason he left. He said, unless you have a credit card with a large credit line, he said it was boring. So he flew to Afghanistan, and the CIA promptly arrested him. And he did hard prison time then. He was in a cell next to Charles Manson for a while.
Ooh.
But here's a guy who, at first, they put him in low security prison. And you know the reason that he ended up low security? They administer a personality test to prisoners to decide where to send them. This is what Leary reported. And he said he was a psychologist, you know, and from Harvard. He said the personality test that they administered him was the Leary psychology test.
His own.
He was the author of the test. He had designed the test. He certainly knew how to answer it. So he ended up in a low-security men's prison, and then he escaped. The Weatherman political group helped him escape. And so the whole story of his escape is told in our movie, Timothy Leary's Dead. You can find it out there. I think that the DVD is still around, and I think it's streaming somewhere online. But it was a great adventure, one of my many, many great adventures, you know, to make that movie. And it certainly was an outgrowth of the fact that I had lived all these things that we report in the book, Blowing America's Mind.
Let me ask you about the CIA today. Do you think that Mkultra is still an active program? I mean, this is, again, a speculative question, but then again, you've also were part of the research, you know, in the 60s at Princeton.
You know, I think everything has changed. I think that with the advances in technology, that everything involved with the world of espionage is completely different than it was back then, because of the tools they have at their disposal now, and the needs and the interests. And look at spying, for example, domestic spying. You know, in the old days, what they had to do, they would have to wiretap somebody's phone. My movie called Marilyn Monroe Declassified deals a lot with the wiretapping of Marilyn Monroe by many different entities. But today, what do they have to wiretap? I mean, everybody is carrying the spy device.
That's right.
That tells everything anybody would want to know about them in their pocket, and it's all accessible. So even though they may claim that they have to get a court order to, you know, get that information and, you know, go after your cell phone, the fact is, you know, they can turn those cell phones on as listening devices anytime they want. Listen to anybody's conversation. And look, Dr. J, this is really interesting. Back in the days before cell phones, when they had, everybody used landlines.
Yes.
There was a time when they were really encouraging people to get more landlines and have a phone in every room. It was a big campaign. And I heard from one undercover guy that part of the reason there was they could use your landline to listen in on what was happening in the room. They could listen in on conversations. So if you had a phone in your bedroom, in addition to the living room, they had easier access from a spying point of view. Today, you know, who needs any of that? It's just the cell phone. It gives them everything they need to know, including with global navigation, they know right where you are at every moment. So is Mkultra still in effect today? Yeah, I don't think so. Or if it is, it's got a different name, and it's changed in its goals, and everything is transformed completely. What we're talking about is part of CIA history. These were the old days. This is what I was part of. You know, I was in Princeton and doing this in the late 1960s. You know, I'm 70 now, And I was, in my early 20s then. So the whole world has changed 5 times over.
Speaking of what you said, everyone these days, they don't really have to, spy the way they used to, because like you said, everyone is carrying these smartphones with GPS, global positioning satellite, like you said, and everyone is updating Facebook, telling them exactly their likes, their friends, what they do, where they're going, they check in, and even back in 2008 or 2007, David Petraeus, then when he was the head of the CIA, he said, we now have the technology to turn on cameras on your computers and phones without you knowing. So on top of these phones listening and telling you where you are, they are also recording visually. And since most phones, I think every smartphone these days has cameras on both sides.
Yeah.
All this gets stored in massive data centers, the NSA, not just in the US, in the UK, I believe in the Five Eyes includes even Australia. So we've really taken it to a new level by giving them so much. The technology is actually killing us in that sense. We're taking it for granted by what we're able to do, but at the same time, we're giving them so much more access to lose our freedom. So,
yeah, not just the audio of what the conversations are, but the cameras on the computers and the phones give them access to peer into any room. So all of that is, sort of the paranoia side of the modern world. On the other hand, how many of us would want to give up these devices because that's true? I wouldn't. You wouldn't. I mean, we like our global positioning driving, right? Unless you just pulled a stick-up job at a bank and you're making a getaway, or you're having an illicit affair that, oh my God, if somebody should find out where you are, that you're at a certain brothel or you're seeing a mistress somewhere, who cares if they know where you are? I mean, really? I mean, do they want to track me to the grocery store? And all right, they'll find out I attend MUFON meetings, right? Mutual UFO Network. Who cares? Unless you really have something to hide. The negative side of it, it's just, okay, so you get used to the fact that privacy as we used to think of it, it really doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's a thing of the past. So do we really need it? How much do we really care about it? I mean, I don't care enough to fight for it. Some people demonstrate about things like related to this. I mean, no, I just think we sort of accept it. The world has changed, but we get these benefits from it. There's great benefits from being connected with the internet, from having, Facebook. We can find people that we lost when we graduated high school. You can reconnect with old friends. So everything is a two-edged sword. And society has clearly made the judgment that we like these devices. We can live with the spying. All right?
You're absolutely right about that. 99.99% of people don't have anything to hide. Really, if they went through my smartphone, through contacts, through pictures, really, what are they going to find that I'm not already talking about? And a lot of the topics that I talk about of the show, if they are upsetting anybody, well, no one's come knocking on my door. I've never come home to see the house disheveled or anything like that. So just like you said, Paul, I'm not that really worried. And like you said, we have changed with the society. And that's one great thing, that you were able to live in that period of time, because the 60s is such a classic period that everybody alludes to, especially as I believe it was the summer of 69, the summer of love.
69 was Woodstock, but the Summer of Love was 67.
67. Regardless, we're still talking about that 51 years later. That's how important things were at that time. Anyway, Paul, we are running out of time, and I do want to actually talk about some other projects you have, because, again, as I mentioned from the beginning of the show, next time, folks, I am going to get Paul for 2 hours. Hopefully, Paul, you can do 2 hours, because I do want to spend time on The Atheist in Heaven again, as well as the Life After Death project and the companion one, which I haven't seen. I do have it. The collector's edition 2-disc set.
Yes.
The personal
second
encounters.
disc. The second disc there, which is streaming on Amazon, Life After Death Project 2, Personal Encounters. I found lots and lots of people who had experiences where they were convinced that they had heard from a loved one or a close friend in some way after that person was deceased. And by the time you've heard a lot of these stories and the emotional impact that they've had on people, you begin to get it. You begin to say, wait a minute, what's the point of denying that this happens anymore? So it was a great project. I mean, it happened to me when Forrest J. Ackerman died, my mentor. At age 92, he died. And he was an atheist, and he said sort of jokingly, turns out that there's a big science fiction convention in the sky afterwards, because he invented the term sci-fi. He was a big science fiction person. He said, if there is that convention, says, maybe when the party dies down, I'd drop you a line if I could, right? So my life changed completely for years after he died, and he dropped me a line. And I couldn't deny it. And there was physical evidence. And it was so powerful. And I actually had stuff I could take to scientists that I got 3 universities involved in the research. And these scientists completely baffled after years of research. And one of them, a chemist, convinced that he began to hear from my deceased friend too. It was just an incredible period in my life from around 2009, and it began to calm down around 7 years later. Still, some strange things happen once in a while, but there were 7 years where I was living in the twilight zone because of that, and that's another story.
Yeah, and that's when people can actually see or hear, should I say, because it is posted on YouTube, an interview that we did do.
The DVD is out there of the Life After Death Project. The book, I'm running out of copies fast. I don't know if I'm going into a second printing on it, but it's An Atheist in Heaven. I really am running out of copies. I think I've got like 12 copies left. Anyway, there's that. And Marilyn Monroe Declassified as an incredible story where, again, it takes place, that's in the early 60s, so it's even before blowing America's mind, when Marilyn Monroe died. And there you really see the CIA at work, too, and what they had to do to wiretap and why they wanted to hear her every conversation and why her life was in danger because of it. So that's streaming on Amazon, or you can buy the Blu-ray or DVD. All this stuff is out there and easy to find. If you go to IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, and look up my name, Paul Davids, David with an S, you get a list of all my movies and the TV shows, and even the name of every Transformers cartoon. And you
79 of them. 79 of them.
Yeah, every name of every show is there. I was there with Stan Lee. Those were great days. I loved working for Marvel on the Transformers. I loved most of the jobs I had in the entertainment business, working for Lucas on the Star Wars books and doing Roswell for Showtime. It's been a charmed existence that I worked really hard to have. And I have had a lot of things that didn't work out, but enough things worked out well that I'm really pleased with the body of work, Dr. J.
Anyone, as I'm sure people have requested this, but has any publisher talked to you about writing your own biography from beginning to end? I mean, I know this Blowing America's Mind, a true story of Princeton, CIA, mind control, LSD, and Zen was about that period, but covering your entire life, everything you've been involved in, the movies.
Well, I'll make a confession and tell you I've begun writing that.
Nice.
I have. And so one day that'll come along.
And like I said, even before that day comes along, we will be talking with you much more about other projects. And that's why I want this audiences who don't know much about Forrest Ackerman or his amazing life or what's happened since he's passed away to definitely tune in for that. And please, everyone out there, even though we didn't spend much on this today because we are going to spend 2 hours on it next time, please go out and watch the Life After Death Project, Part 1 and 2, the personal encounters, and also everything else that Mr. Davids just said. Just like he said, IMDb, that's actually what I ended up looking up. And because I subscribe to Amazon Prime, I am able to watch Marilyn Monroe Declassified tonight. Paul, it's been fantastic to have you on. I would love to thank you off air, but we do have another guest. But let me ask you real quick, to plug in, you've already mentioned where people can watch things on Prime, where to find your videos on IMDb. Let's talk about where people can buy your books.
Well, go to Amazon, and the books you'd be looking for are An Atheist in Heaven and Blowing America's Mind. I'm an artist, and if you go to blurb.com and look up the art of Paul Jeffrey Davids, there's 5 coffee table books of my paintings of New York, Paris, Mexico, the California coast. So there's that out there. There's 3 books of my poetry that I think you can find that at Amazon too, or at lulu.com. I wrote poems to read while driving on freeways and other ways to die laughing. I wrote poems to read when you run out of weed, and right-brained poems for left-brained people. So there's all of that, and then there's 6 Star Wars books, beginning with The Glove of Darth Vader. It's often called the Jedi Prince series. My first book is The Fires of Pele, Mark Twain's legendary journal, which is a Hawaii story. So, by searching around, you can find all of it. By the way, there's someone else named Paul Davids who's a guitar player. There's instructional music videos out there, and he doesn't use a middle initial either. So sometimes people are writing about me, and I look at the picture that they post, and hey, it's Paul Davids of Holland. That's not me.
Well, you're Paul Jeffrey Davids.
So that's why I started using my middle initial, Paul J. Davids. So there you go. Now there's a Davids who was just elected, I think, in Kansas to Congress. What's her first name? I don't know, Shania or Shalia or something like that. And her last name is Davids, and she's in the news now because of the election. So Davids is not the rare name anymore that it used to be.
Yeah, because usually you see David. You're absolutely right.
Or and Davis.
You were the first Davis, yeah, Davis without the D.
Yeah.
You were the first Davids that I've ever seen, and until you mentioned these other 2, I've never seen it. Again, Paul Davids, thank you so much for this interview. And again, like I said, I would thank you off air, but we do have another guest, so I want to thank you now. And again, wait for my call to bring you back on soon to talk more about the fascinating life of Forrest Ackerman and the fascinating life he's had after his death. Once again, thank you, Paul, and everybody stay tuned. When we come back, we'll be back with another guest. And Paul, like I said, I wish I could thank you off air, but I can't, so I'm thanking you on air.
Thank you, Dr. J.
Thanks again. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be right back with Mr. Patrick Aldenhall. That's right, everybody. We'll be right back.